Welcome fellow disciples, this is Sigarda Priest, and I'm bringing a deck tech to you all today. The deck I'll be bringing to you all will be Sigarda, the host of Herons. A little bit of background for Sigarda is she was actually the first commander I built, so this will be like a homage to that deck in particular, and so let's jump into this, starting with the commander. So for a 5 mana, double white, single green, 2 generic, get a 5/5 flying hexproof angel with the ability spells your opponent's control can't cause you to sacrifice permanents. This effectively means that you have a large flyer that is very hard to remove outside of just board wipes, as spot removal and any sacrifice effects won't get rid of it. This helps protect your board as well as have a constant threat from mid to late game where commander damage can matter more. Otherwise, we've got what would be the main purpose of the deck. A token sub-theme as well as 2 combos. Starting with the combos, we'll look at what they are and how to perform them. First is Elish Norn Grand Cinnavite for 7 mana, 5 generic, double white, 4/7, Vigilance, Praetor, which has the ability other creatures you control get +2/+2, and creatures your opponents control get -2/-2. The combo piece with Elish Norn is Kamol, Fist of Crozer, for 6 mana, 4 generic, and double green for a 4/3 human druid, who has the ability for 1 green, target land becomes a 1/1 creature until end of turn. It's still a land. And 2 generic triple green, creatures you control gets +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. So basically overrun and turn a land into a creature for 1 green. So the combo, if you have not noticed it already, is having Elish Norn and Kamol on the field at the same time, where your opponent's creatures are getting -2/-2, and pay 1 green to turn one of their lands into a creature, which will receive that neg as well, putting it below 0, which as a state-based effect will die and go to the graveyard. This ends in a result of a 1 green for a strip mine effect, which is very powerful and very game ending due to limiting your opponent's resources while also giving your field a large buff and trample. Moving on, we've got the last combo, which is the classic Karmic Guide Revelark loop. This involves 3 pieces, but can have additional pieces put in for varying effects. The core part of this combo involves Karmic Guide, a 5 mana, 3 generic, and double white for a 2/2 Angel Spirit with flying, protection from black, echo of 3 generic, double white, with the ability, when Karmic Guide enters the battlefield, return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. Next is Revelark, which is a 5 mana, 4 generic, 1 white, for a 4/3 elemental with flying, which has the following effect: when Revelark leaves the battlefield, return up to 2 target creatures with power 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. It also has the alternative costing of evoke, 5 generic, and 1 white. The last piece of the combo is any sacrifice outlet. For this combo, we're going to be using Phyrexian Altar, as it does produce coloured. So Phyrexian Altar is a 3 generic artifact which has the following ability: sacrifice a creature, produce 1 of any color. So if you're unaware of what the combo is, let me quickly explain. This can start with either Revelark or Karmic Guide starting on the field, or one or the other in the graveyard, and Phyrexian Altar being on the field. So let's start with them both on the field and go through the loop. So step 1 is sacrificing Karmic Guide, producing 1 of any color. Then we'll sacrifice Karmic Guide, which will produce 1 of any color and have a trigger from Karmic Guide, reanimating up to 2 creatures with power 2 or less. So main target is Karmic Guide, and a second target will allow alternative effects to this loop, which I'll come back to. So once Karmic Guide is reanimated, it will have an enter the battlefield trigger, which will target Revelark, reanimating it and leaving you in the same board presence we had at the beginning, but with 2 coloured mana of our choice. And so this loop gives us infinite coloured mana of any colour, which can be used with mana sinks, which we run a few of. Let's start with the token generation mana sinks, which is Heliod, God of the Sun, for 4 mana, 3 generic and a white, 5/6 enchantment creature god with indestructible, and as long as your devotion to white is less than 5, Heliod isn't a creature, and other creatures have vigilance. Lastly, for 4 mana, 2 generic, double white, put a 2/1 white cleric enchantment creature token on the battlefield. This is the mana sync that will make infinite 2/1s, as simple as that. Alternatively, we have Ant Queen for 5 mana, 3 generic, double green, for a 5/5 insect, who for 2 mana, a generic and green, will put a 1/1 green insect creature on the battlefield. Both of these creatures just make infinite tokens, and if you keep your board by the next turn, you win through infinite combat damage. Alternatively, we have 3 creatures who give infinite power and toughness, starting with Kamal, who I previously mentioned, gives +3/+3 and trample. Alternatively, we have Shalai, Voice of Plenty, for 4 mana, 3 generic, 1 white, 3/4 angel with flying. You, planeswalkers you control, and other creatures you control have hexproof. And for 6 mana, 4 generic, double green, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. Although this doesn't have trample, between Shalai and Sigarda both having evasion, you should usually be able to get in for some hits, worst case scenario. Alternatively, we do have Nylea, Go of the Hunt, for 4 mana, 3 generic and green, 6/6 enchantment god with indestructible. As long as your devotion to green is less than 5, Nylea isn't a creature. Other creatures have trample, and for 4 mana, 3 generic, 1 green, target creature gets +2/+2 till end of turn, which acts very similar to Kamal, just need more activations to have the same effect. Now, these are the mana sinks we have for the combo. Now let's go back to before where I mentioned that we can add additional effects to the combo. So the main effect we can add is Eternal Witness into the loop, because Reveler can get 2 creatures with power 2 or less. And if we can infinitely loop a Eternal Witness, this means we can infinite loop anything we can return to the graveyard, such as an instant sorcery creature, artifact that sacrifices like a Mind Stone. This adds potentials of, like, say, a Mind Stone during your deck, Avenger of Zendikar, infinite tokens, a Chord of Calling, allowing us to get all our creatures onto the board at instant speed, which we could do at the end of the player before us. Or we can also use Chord of Calling to slowly build up protection pieces while the opponents try and deal with us before our turn if we can't win on our turn previously, such as Archetype of Endurance and Shalai having a layering effect of hexproof, which will affect you and all your creatures, or Avacyn giving indestructible to everything, which protects Phyrexian Altar, which is very important because outside of the creatures, Phyrexian Altar isn't very protectable. This concludes our combos, so let's move on to how we get to the combos, starting with ramp. Now, I have a few philosophies about ramp. Firstly, anything that costs more than 3 needs to be doing something significantly well, such as getting multiple treasures, doubling our mana. Even Sky Shroud Claim, which gets us 2 lands, is quite close to the cutting board for me. And first up, we got Mana Creep. 0 mana, taps for double colorless. At the beginning of your upkeep, flip a coin. If you lose, take 3 damage, which is an all-round amazing card, probably out of people's budget now as it has been spiking. Hopefully it will get a reprint this year, but who knows. But I do include it in everything because of it acting as a second Soul Ring, which next up is Soul Ring. In every precon, for 1 mana, taps for 2 colorless. As simple as that. It's amazing. Probably the strongest card in Magic, arguably. So those are our 2 super cheap ramp in Artifact. Then we have multiple 2-drop artifacts. We got Arcane Signet, which costs 2, taps for any color in our commander's identity. We have Fellow Stone, costs 2 again, taps for any color our opponents can tap for. So usually if you just consider a colorless rock, but it might be actually an Arcane Signet, it's pretty handy. Then we have Marble Diamond and Moss Diamond. They both cost 2 and to tap. Marble taps for white and Moss taps for green. It's very useful for our low colored decks. It fills that space where we have cheap ramp. Then we have Mind Stone, cost 2, tap for a colorless, can pay 1, sacrifice it, draw a card. Then we have Lesnia Signet, which costs 2. You pay 1 to produce 1 green, 1 white, which nets 1 mana. Then we have Talisman of Unity, costs 2, as most of these will. It taps for a colorless, or you can pay 1 life to tap for green or white. And lastly, for artifacts, we've got Thought Vessel. Costs 2, you have no maximum hand size, and taps for a colorless. Moving on, we got our sorceries, which is Nature's Law, 3 visits, and Farseek. So Nature's Law and 3 visits, cost 2, 1 green and 1, search your library for a forest and put it on the battlefield. Then we have Farseek, which costs 2, costs 1 generic, 1 green, search for plains, island, swamp, or mountain card and put it onto the battlefield tap. This effectively gets us any plains like a temple garden or savannah. We run Sky Shroud Claim. I think it's quite cuttable, but because of the high CMC in this deck, averaging around 5 and 6, I think it does fit nicely. So for 4 mana, 3 and green, search your library for up to 2 forest cards and put it on the battlefield. So basically 2 Nature's Laws put together. Next, we've got Carper Flowers, Smothering Tide, and Mirari's Wake for our enchantments. Carper Flowers, either main phase as long as you haven't used it, add up to X mana of 1 color to your mana pool, where X is the number of islands target opponent controls. Very strong, and worst case scenario, you're not versing a blue player. Then we have Smothering Tide, who is a 4-drop, 3 and white enchantment. Whenever our opponent draws a card, unless they pay 2, you make a treasure. And lastly, we have Mirari's Wake for 5 mana, 3 white, green. Creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever you tap a land for a mana, produce 1 mana of any type that land produced. This can also be interchanged with Mana Reflection, but I think the buffing in power is very relevant. You could even cut Sky Shroud Claim for a Mana Reflection, as it does mean our rocks also tap for double. Lastly, we do have Phyrexian Altar. I kind of put this outside as you wouldn't really use it as ramp most of the time, but it can be used sometimes to sacrifice small creatures or tokens you have made to cast a bigger spell. That's it for ramp, so let's move on to draw, which draws us cards, refills our hand, and gets us to our ramp and payoffs. So we don't run a huge lot, but we do run Esper Sentinel for 1 white, artifact creature human soldier, 1/1, first non-creature spell, each turn, draw a card unless they pay X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. Usually this will only cost 1, so it's just like a small Mystic Remora, but on a creature in white, very strong card draw, will usually draw you at least 1 to 2 cards a game. Then we have Sylvan Library, the powerhouse of greens card draw. So for 2 mana, a generic and green enchantment. At the beginning of your draw step, you may draw an additional 2 cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand you draw in this turn. For each card of those cards, pay full life or put the card on top of your library. Very strong card, amazing, super cheap, and combos immensely well with Abundance, who for 4 mana, 2 generic, double green enchantment. If you would draw a card, you may instead choose land or non-land, reveal cards until you reach the chosen kind, put that card into your hand, and then you put all the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So with Sylvan Library, because you don't draw those cards, you put them into your hand, Sylvan Library won't see you drawing cards, so you won't have to choose any cards that you've quote unquote drawn this turn to put back, so you won't have to pay any life. Very strong, amazing. I played this way back in 2012. It's insane. The fact that Abundance is a 4-drop hurts a bit, but the effect's really strong in my opinion, especially when we don't have much draw, as it means we can get our next land drops if we need land, or make sure we get gas when we don't need any more land. Next, we have Mentor of the Meek, since we are a token deck, and hopefully make lots of mana. So for 3 mana, 2 generic and a white for a 2/2 human soldier, with the ability, whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1 generic. If you do, draw a card. So this is repeatable, was considered a break for white for the longest time, and is very good if, say, with Ant Queen, we can pay 3 mana in total, 1 green, 2 generic, and make a 1/1 and draw a card. That's pretty good rate when you consider the colors we are in, and it's repeatable. Next, the last part of draw, we have Guardian Project. For 4 mana, 3 generic, green. Enchantment: whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. Very strong draw in a creature-centric deck. Even though we make tokens, the way we make tokens is from creatures, so we'll still draw from those creatures entering before we then proceed to make more tokens. Also means we can draw a deck when we're looping Revel Karmic Guide. Now, to make up for how little draw power we have, we run a fair amount of tutors. One of them, Enlightened Tutor, searches for enchantment or artifact. It is the only way to find Phyrexian Altar, which is a very important part of our combo. Otherwise, it can also search for protection in Archetype of Endurance and Privileged Position. It can search for another creature tutor in Survival of the Fittest or Defense of the Heart. It can also tutor for removal in Grasp of Fate and Aura Shards, as well as it can also find multiple ramp pieces in Mirari's Wake, Smothering Tide, The Rocks, Cup of Flowers. A very versatile and useful card. Next, we've got our 6 creature tutors. We got Green Sun Zenith, which is for green and X. Search for a green creature with CMC X or less, put it on the battlefield, and shuffle Green Sun Zenith into the deck. We have Worldly Tutor for 1 green. Search for a creature card, put it on top of a library. We have Eldamaru's Call, green and white. Search for a creature card, put it in our hand. God of Calling, X, triple green, instant, Convoke. Search your library for a creature with CMC X, put it on the battlefield. And then we have our 2 enchantments I mentioned before. Survival of the Fittest, 2, generic and green. Pay 1 green to start a creature card. Search your deck for a creature, put it in your hand. And Defense of the Heart, a favorite of mine for a long time. 3, green, enchantment. During your upkeep, if one of your opponents controls 3 or more creatures, sacrifice Defense of the Heart, search for 2 creatures, and put those onto the battlefield. Very strong, it immediately gets us Karmic Guide Revelark. It can also get Elish Non-Kamal. It can also get Avacyn in Archetype of Endurance. Very strong, hard to remove, only through mass, bounce, or exile effects can that be alleviated. So it is a favourite of mine, costs half the cost of Tooth and Nail, which used to be a massive staple, but it's kind of come out as 9 mana, get 2 creatures, put 2 creatures on the battlefield, isn't nearly strong enough anymore. Next, we have our small recursion package. So we have Eternal Witness, I did mention before, for 3 mana, 1 generic double green, 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, return a target card from your graveyard to your hand. Very strong, amazing card, so much utility. Then we have Sun Titan for 6 mana, 4 generic double white, 6/6 giant, vigilance. When Sun Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent with CMC 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So some useful things are Phyrexian Altar, or fetches so we can go get more lands, or just any sort of low drops that we want to get back that have died throughout the game. Next we have Emeria the Sky Ruin, which is a land. Enters tap and it taps for a white. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 7 or more planes, you may return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. Very useful, great way to get back up big creatures like Elish Non or Kamal late game. Lastly, we have Praetor's Council. For 8 mana, 5 generic, triple green, sorcery. Return all cards from your graveyard to your hand. Exile Praetor's Council, and you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. So this can be a massive blowout after several board wipes, spot removal happening for everything. It's getting late in the game, you slam this down, you get all your cards back, and you just get another shot at everything you have done throughout the game. Super handy, can't go wrong. Is a bit expensive, but again, our ramp package supports these expensive cards, so we can play them fairly consistently in mid to late game. Now, let's take a look at removal. I run a fair amount of density for removal because I do believe interaction is very important, especially when you have white, because you have access to Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, and Generous Gifts, which I think are some of the best removal cards in the game. So let's go through it. Let's start with Path to Exile. So for 1 white, instant, exile target creature, its control may search their library for a basic and put it on the field tap. Clean, exiled so they can't recur it, instant speed, 1 mana. Very good. Not as good as the next one, Swords to Plowshares. for 1 white, instant speed. Exile target creature, its controller gains life equal to its power. Because of how weak life gain is in EDH, it doesn't matter if they gain 10 to 20 life, because you likely can hit them for either commander damage, infinite damage, combo off, or just have an immense amount of damage that you're going to get them in regardless. And again, Exile is super useful due to not being able to recur that card. Next we've got Generous Gift, 3 mana, 2 generic white, instant, destroy target permanent. Its controller gets a 3/3 green elephant creature. The fact that they get a creature isn't a huge deal, as the versatility of destroying permanents is very strong. Being able to hit a planeswalker, enchantment, these are the things that really make Generous Gift useful. Even though 3 mana does seem to be a lot, but Beast Within and Generous Gifts are both quite strong due to that versatility. Next we have Aura Shards, which is an enchantment, costs 3, a generic green white. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can destroy target artifact and enchantment. This is an insanely devastating card. Even in a non-token deck, just a deck that runs a lot of creatures, you're going to be hitting artifacts and enchantments left, right and center. It'll mean people won't play their big enchantments and artifacts that might seem like a threat, and will also absolutely devastate enchantment and artifact decks if they can't protect their field. Honestly, it's awful to play against if you are one of those decks, and sometimes you do feel a little bit bad. You might instead not destroy everything, because it is a May. Next we have Grasp of Fate, which is for 3 mana enchantment, 1 generic double white. When it enters, exile a non-land permanent for each opponent until Grasp of Fate leaves the battlefield. So basically a O-ring for each opponent. So very strong. The fact that it hits 3 things for 1 card, massive card advantage. The fact that they can get it back is a bit annoying, but that is just the downside of how strong it can be. Next we have Besiju, who endures. New card, it's a legendary land, taps for a green, comes in untapped. Very important. Has channel for 2, a generic and green. Discard this card. Destroy target enchantment or artifact or non-basic land an opponent controls. That player may search the library for a land card, the basic land type, and put it on the field. This activated ability costs 1 generic less for each legendary creature you control. So very strong. It kind of counts towards your spell slot more than your land slot, but the fact that it comes in untapped, it means it can be used even early game if you do need that land, and it taps for colored. Lastly, we have Reclamation Sage for 2 and a green, 2/1 Elf Shaman. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact or enchant. Versatile, cheap creature that gets rid of problematic cards like a Soul Ring, a Mana Creep, or enchantments that are very powerful like a Aura Shards, a Grasp of Fate, or O-Ring, upwards to the bigger stuff like a Godfarrow statue, a Forsaken Monument. There's tons of options to destroy, and the fact that it's a 2/1 means you can put it in the loop of Reveler Karmic Guide, but sometimes you gotta remove more than just one thing. That's where our Wraths come in. So we run the classic Day of Judgment and Wrath of God as clean, cheap sweepers. So Day of Judgment costs 2 generic, double white, and just destroys all creatures, a sorcery. Wrath of God is the same, however, they can't be regenerated in addition. This usually is very irrelevant and doesn't matter, but sometimes it does pop up and is a handy little addition. Next we have the versatility of Austere Command for 6 mana, 4 generic double white sorcery, where you can choose 2 of the 4 options, which are destroy all artifacts, destroy enchantments, destroy all creatures with CMC 3 or less, and destroy all creatures with CMC 4 or greater. A thing to be noted here is that the effects will resolve from top to bottom. So if you pick the top one, destroy all artifacts, and then the last one, destroy all creatures with CMC 4 or greater, it will resolve the top one and the next one. So say they have a Forsaken Monument, you'll destroy all artifacts, destroying the Forsaken Monument, and then you'll destroy all creatures with CMC 4 or greater, and will destroy all the creatures that are, because the Forsaken Monument has already been destroyed. Very useful, very versatile. The fact that it hits enchantments and artifacts, very relevant. And for that same reason is why we run Fracturing Gas. So for 2 generic, 3 hybrid green white, instant, destroy all artifacts and enchantments. You gain 2 life for each permanent destroyed this way. The fact it's instant and we do have things we want to be activating at instant speed is really helpful. We can hold up in case something starts getting out of hand, we need life gain, so forth and so on. Very useful, very handy. And yeah, it definitely can be replaced for just more traditional board wipes. Next is how do we stop other people's spot removal and wraths. So we run a few protection pieces in this deck since we do go wide, and going wide's weakness is wraths and spot removal. So we run Flawless Maneuver for 3 mana, 2 generic white, instant, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. The important part here is if you control a commander, you may cast this spell without paying its mana cost. So a free, indestructible, your board, very useful. The fact it's free is what's the biggest thing. Next we have Teferi's Protection for 3 mana again, 2 generic and white, instant, until your next turn. Your life total can't change, you have protection from everything, all permanents you control phase out, exile Teferi's Protection. The big benefit from this is in response to someone's wrath or your own even, you get to keep your board, remove everyone else's. The other thing that's very useful is the fact that if someone's popping off with damage or a big board, you can save yourself and then potentially wrath the board the next turn. The downside of Teferi's Protection, which I believe they should definitely have added onto it, was the fact that you can still lose the game to winning the game effects, like Thassa's Oracle, Second Sun. The cutest part about Teferi's Protection is if someone's taking a lot of turns or infinite turns, Teferi's Protection means they can't win if they don't have any of the win the game effects, and then therefore have to end the turn, giving you the turn to respond, which is really funny. Next we have Karmic's Will, which is for 4 mana, 3 generic and a white, instant, choose one. If you control a commander, as you cast a spell you may choose both. So for the first one is creatures you control gain flame, vigilance and double strike, and the other option is creatures you control gain lifelink, indestructible and protection from all colors. Both of these are till end of turn, and so this is a great way to have a wide board, lift off the ground, gain double strike, vigilance and life gain, can't be blocked. Very well easy ways to end the game when the board is locked and you can't attack through other people's boards, as well as the fact that this is an instant that gives indestructible and pro all colors, means it's a great way to play on the other side where you need to protect your board either from people attacking you or from a board wipe. Very useful, very versatile, relatively cheap. Next we have Privileged Position and Archetype of Endurance, both of which are ways to give hexproof to your board. So Privileged Position is 2 generic triple hybrid green for 5 mana, enchantment. Other permanents you control have hexproof, but Privileged Position. It means there's an added layer of protection, and people in colors say red and black, they don't have, if any, removal for this, and therefore can't deal with the rest of your board. Next we have Archetype of Endurance for 8 mana, 6 generic, double green, 6/5 enchantment ball. Creatures you control have hexproof, creatures your opponents control lose hexproof and can't gain hexproof. The fact it gives itself hexproof is the biggest part, unlike Privileged Position, so the only way to kill it is either by removing hexproof altogether or by board wipe. Then we have Avacyn, Angel of Hope for 8 mana, 5 generic, triple white, 8/8 Angel, Flying, Vigilance. Avacyn and all permanents you control have indestructible. So like I mentioned before with Defense of the Heart, if you get Archetype and Avacyn, they give each other hexproof and indestructible, and so the only way to remove them is by the exile or bounce effect like Cyclonic Rift. Now let's take a look at the things that we want to protect. So we have a small package of token generation that is mostly all repeatable or produces a lot. So let's start with Adeline, Resplendent Cathar for 3 mana for a generic double white X4 human knight with vigilance. Her power is equal to the number of creatures you control, and whenever you attack, for each opponent create a 1/1 white human token that's tapped and attacking that player or planeswalker they control. So basically you play her down, you attack with any creature, it doesn't have to be her, and you make a couple tokens. Hopefully some of them survive, most likely some of them won't, but once we have more buffs on the field, then she'll show her worth, as well as she is just a big creature that can hit hard and has vigilance. Next we have Torrin, Fist of the Angels, for 3 mana, generic white green, 2/2 legendary human cleric with training, and whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 green white human soldier with training. Now this is an amazing card in a creature heavy deck, so when you play him and then you play another creature, you get a token, play another creature, you get a token, and these creature tokens and him grow alongside your board, as long as you're playing bigger things. Then we have Heliod and Ant Queen, which I have mentioned before as sinks, but you can also just play them and slowly grow a board. Next we have Major, Protector, I want to say, completely butchered this, for 5 mana, 2 generic, green and double white for 2/3. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white human warrior. This is okay. What we really play her for is the fact that she has an anthem. She gives all other creatures you control +1/+1. This makes Idoline's tokens be 2/2s, which are significantly going to be harder to block. It makes Ant Queen's tokens 2/2s, makes Heliod's tokens 3/2s, makes Torrin's tokens 2/2s, plus can get counters. Lastly, we have Avenger of Zendikar, because we do run a fair amount of land ramp as well. So Avenger of Zendikar for 7 mana, 5 generic double green, 5/5 elemental. When Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant token for each land you control. So theoretically that should be about 6 to 7 at minimum, and then it also has the effect landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a 1/1 counter on each plant you control. This gets out of hand very quickly. Say if you draw and held onto ramp cards like a Nature's Law or Sky Shroud Claim, and you played Avenger of Zendikar, and then you slap down one of those ramp and you buff everything by 1 or 2, then you have like a major and they gain another buff. You're going to have a lot of power on the field. Also, something that pairs up very nicely with these tokens is an alternative win con in Triumph of the Hordes, which I didn't mention before, as this is a better time to mention it. For 4 mana, 2 generic double green sorcery. Until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1, trample and infect. So this means your 0/1 plants become 1/2 plants with trample and infect. You just got to hit someone for 10. By hitting them for 10 infect, you end their game. It's really good for just ending the game with tokens, but if you don't like infect, or just switch it out with an overrun, it will likely do very similar things, you just need more damage. Lastly, for non-land cards, we've got our utility cards, which don't really have a category to go in, they're just very useful. Starting with, we got Champion of Lamholt for 3 mana, a generic double green 1/1. Creatures with power less than Champion of Lamholt's power can't block creatures you control. Whenever another creature enters under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Champion. So basically, she just makes your field unblockable. That's the whole idea, that's what she's there for. She's just so you can get in with those small creatures and break parity. Next we have Mimic Vat for 3 generic, artifact, imprint. Whenever a non-token creature dies, you may exile that card. If you do, return each other card exiled with Mimic Vat to its owner's graveyard. And then it has the activability of 3 generic, tap, create a token that's a copy of the card exiled with Mimic Vat, gains haste, exile at the beginning of the next end step. Basically, it means we can keep our useful cards, or we can keep dumb cards and just keep ETBing them after a board wipe, like Avenger of Zendikar. We've got Elvish Piper that I'll mention next. We've got Avacyn. If somehow it goes to the graveyard, you can have an instant Avacyn. Putting a Suntide in under it's very strong. You can put a Karmic Guide under it. You could just reanimate a creature every turn. And then it also has the versatility of taking other people's creatures that have died. So you can still someone's amazing ETB that's just, you could steal people's Eternal Witness. There's plethora of options, and that versatility just helps out this deck a little bit more. Next we have Silverblade Paladin, which is to pair up with our commander. So for 3 mana, a generic double white 2/2, a human knight, has Soulbond. As long as Silverblade Paladin is paired with another creature, both have double strike. So Sigarda having double strike, very strong. It only takes 3 hits to kill someone. Very threatening. and if you've already hit people a few times, it can only be one hit maybe, and that's where the next card, Wiltleaf Liege, comes into, buffing your commander as well as buffing your tokens. So for one generic, triple hybrid, green, white, 4/4 elf die. If a spell ability your opponent controls would cause you to discard Wiltleaf Liege, you may put it on the battlefield under your control. Lastly, it gives all other green creatures +1/+1, and all other white creatures +1/+1. So this means creatures like Sigarda, who are both colours, get both of the buff. And so she'll be a 7/7, adding Silverblade Paladin. She's now a double striker, 2 hitting people to kill them. Very strong, ends games fairly quickly, and you don't need a whole lot of board presence. And this is really what pushes Sigarda as being a strong commander damage centric commander, which I may make a deck about another time. 3 more cards. So we got Elvish Piper. Very simple, so 4 mana, 3 generic, green, 1/1 elf, pay 1 green, tap it, put a creature from your hand into play. We play expensive creatures, this makes it really cheap. Next we have Seaborn Muse. For 5 mana, very generic, double green, 2/4 spirit, untaps all permanents you control during each other player's untap step. Crazy good card. It also means all our syncs can be used repeatedly, as well as all our instant speed interaction. Lastly, we have True Conviction, 6 mana enchantment, 3 generic, triple white, creatures in control of double strike and lifelink. So this plays as a life gain, because we don't have a huge amount of it, and as well as double strike. Double strike on your creatures, the tokens, like buffing them by 1 or 2, giving them double strike immense value, or even our commander, as I mentioned, allows us to triple hit people. This makes our commander a bigger threat, and means it can force people to have to board wipe to answer just your commander, which means you can just play your commander again and go onto the offense. Lastly, we have lands. Nothing too special about lands. I already mentioned the 2 cards that kind of strive off my generic land base lists, which is Besiju and Emiria, but I'll quickly run through. So because it's a 2-colored deck, we run the 7 fetches: Arid Mesa, Flooded Strand, Misty Rainforest, Marsh Flat, Verdant Catacombs, Windswept Heath, and Wooded Hills, as well as Prismatic Vista to bump it up to 8. And then we have 2 dual lands, so we have both Savannah and Temple Garden being untapped fetchable lands. Canopy Vista is definitely playable. I'd happily recommend it over a Savannah, and then even if you need to go budget for a Temple Garden, just chuck in the snow covered dual land. Next we have our rainbow lands. So we have Command Tower, Forbidden Orchard, Mana Confluence, and City of Brass. I exclude Exotic Orchard because we're only 2 colors and it's more likely going to act as a colorless land for this mana base. However, it is playable for sure if you're in a more heavy green-white meta. So these just tap for any color, they just act effectively as copies of Command Tower. A Forbidden Orchard with the downside of giving tokens to your opponents, however you can use that as a political tool. Next we have our dual colored non-fetchables with Bountiful Promenade, the Bow Bond green-white land. Amazing card. Got Overgrown Farmland. I'm a massive fan of slow lands. I think they're amazing. Then we have Sun Petal Grove. It's a check land. You should have some form of forest or plains for it to come in untapped. If not, it's turn 1 and it should not matter immensely. One last one is Bushland, which is the pain land for green white. So it taps for a colorless, so we can pay 1 life and tap for a green or white. Lastly, we got our basics, which I run snow coloreds for everything. You don't really have to, I just like them. So we run 6 plains, 4 forests. The reason why we run more plains, there's no real reason. You could easily change it to 5/5. You could up the forest because we do have a lot of triple green, but we also have a lot of triple white as well. I just have not changed it. Lastly, we have the power ranking. I'm a big fan of it. I think there's definitely issues. I'd love to discuss ways to make it better or more concrete, like say pointing every card and adding up to a total, and also pointing combos, but that's a discussion for another time. For Sigarda, I feel that she's a 6 to 7, closer to a 7 than a 6. The fact her combos are very expensive and clunky is a downside. However, the fact we do run so many tutors to find these pieces, I think bumps it up. I think Sigarda offers not a whole lot to this kind of archetype in essence.